First, I'm going to speak to you about matters of journalism and process when it comes to investigating a subject like the Iraq War, the way policy towards Iraq and towards the war on terrorism in general has unfolded over the last 4 or 5 years, the 5 years since the September 11th attacks. The Atlantic has had a particular approach here, which I think there's ways in which it's inventive in non-obvious fashions. I want to tell you a little bit about that because it did affect the approach I was taking in the articles that make up much of this book. So I'm going to talk first about process and journalism. Second, I'm going to talk about a number of specific areas which I touch on in this book and are very much in the news. Those, as you might guess, are Iraq, Iran, and the larger war on terrorism, quote unquote, and have sort of an updating on each of those, of where I think they are going and what the difficult questions are in each case. And then finally, I'm going to raise what I, having been involved in covering this topic for most of the last 5 years, what I think of as the hardest lasting questions to deal with, ones that all of us will be grappling with, I think, for quite a while. And I will not be able to answer any of them, but I'll give you my best attempts for the ways to think about them and what their various importances are. So that is the plan for the next few minutes. First is a matter of process. I don't know how many of you here are journalists. Actually, are many of you here professional journalists? A couple. And so I can then, without belaboring the obvious, I can tell the rest of you something that may not be clear to those outside the business. The overwhelming factor, one of the most important factors in how different branches of the media go about what they cover and how they do it is actually the production cycles they work under, the lead times they have, how much time they have to look into a story, how far ahead of time they have to guess what will be important. This is a particularly agonizing burden for a monthly magazine like the Atlantic Monthly, because if we have a physical lead time of, well, our magazines are on the stand for 1 month apiece, which means if a story were conceived the day before it went on the press, it still would be a month old while that issue is still on the press. There are other kinds of production factors, and the reality, when you allow all the time for editing and reporting and everything else that goes into making a magazine a story, is that we have to think of a story probably 6 to 8 months ahead of when the readers will get it. It's a very difficult task, and to find things that will not be either overtaken by events or covered by somebody else or entirely boring. The craft of trying to find ways that something that as we in the fall of 2006 imagine as editors of the Atlantic are doing right now, what will be interesting in February and March 2007. It's not an easy thing. And this was a particular challenge that we faced when the world of politics and journalism and international affairs was very, very significantly changed 5 years ago with the September 11th attacks. We had the leadership of the Atlantic Monthly at that time was two very remarkable people in different ways. One, of course, was Michael Kelly, whose story many of you may know. He had been an editor of a number of magazines, of the New Republic, most recently before coming to the Atlantic. He'd recently become editor of the Atlantic Monthly, and he had cut his teeth journalistically covering the first Gulf War. And so he was determined, despite our lead time, despite the fact that we can publish so infrequently, despite the fact that we do very long articles, the Atlantic would find some way to put its mark on coverage of this new stage of international affairs. And the person who really was responsible for making that goal come to some kind of approximate reach was a man named Cullen Murphy, who for 20 years, from 1985 until just last fall, 2005, was the managing editor of the Atlantic Monthly. And in fact, every one of the articles that's included in this book came from a discussion I had with Cullen Murphy, and really an idea from Cullen Murphy about how 6 or 8 or 9 months from now something would be relevant. And the biggest bet that Cullen Murphy made with Mike Kelly's approval and with my time and work was in March of 2002, when U.S. troops were still in Afghanistan, fighting very seriously in Afghanistan, when Iraq was sort of a vague cloud on the horizon. Cullen placed the bet that within a year the United States would be at war in Iraq, and certainly militarily we would win. And what the Atlantic should be doing then is sort of placing its bets on the next question people would ask. After we conquered Iraq, after U.S. troops took Baghdad, what would be the issues then? And so he had me for the next 3 or 4 months go out and interview experts on every kind of occupation that had happened any time, whether it was Kosovo or Panama or Germany or Japan, or you name the occupied place, and trying to say, what is the predictable sequence of events? How would that predictable sequence be altered in the case of Iraq? How would it be altered knowing what we know about the U.S.'s strengths and weaknesses in running occupations? And this was, I mentioned this for a couple of reasons. This was an article we published. It was called The 51st State. It came out in the Atlantic Monthly with a cover date of November 2002, but for reasons of trying to get it into the flow of news, we put it on our website in August 2002. Again, that shows you the built-in lead time. By August, we'd finished an article that was going to come out in the November issue. And it was, I'll say more about it in a moment. At a conceptual level, there are two ways that a magazine like ours can approach this kind of breaking story, given our long lead time. We can't do sort of very fast investigation. We can't tell you what happened yesterday on the streets of Baghdad, but we can do two kinds of things that often get left behind in the sweep of other news coverage. One of those is what we think of as anticipatory journalism, that is, asking the question that the newspapers won't get around to until they don't have time to do it with any kind of thoroughness. And the other is reconstruction journalism, or trying to find a way to piece together a story, a result that everybody knows how the result came out, but you don't know why. And both of those strands are ones that I and other writers for The Atlantic have followed over the last 5 years, and articles I have in here, as I'll mention, illustrate each of those approaches. The 51st State obviously was anticipatory journalism. What are the questions we'll be asking, we should be asking? Well, the questions we will be asking after conquering Iraq, and we should be asking, before considering doing this. It was a fascinating exercise for me in a couple of ways. One is how relatively easy it was to find an abundance of material. There have been enough occupations in the living past. So there are a lot of occupation experts around, and there are a lot of experts on Iraq and a lot of experts on counterinsurgency warfare and all the other elements that went in there. And I was able, after talking to a lot of these people, to find consensus on even a timetable of what are the problems an occupying power faces. For example, in the first day or two after any sort of decapitation raid, as was the case in Iraq, the problem starting about 36 hours in is looting. And if you don't control the looting, you've lost 5 years' worth of social order. And so being prepared for looting is the first thing. And then to be prepared for the electric supply and the water supply. That those are the main things that determine whether the people will be on your side or not. Then to recognize that almost immediately the clock starts running and you turn from a liberator to an occupier. And it's sort of like a on-sale date for yogurt or something very perishable, that it just goes like that. And then there would be the sectarian revenge killings. Then there'd be the need to reconstitute the police force. And it was striking to me when writing this article before the war how much consensus there was. And I laid this out in ways that turned out, unfortunately, to be quite accurate in predicting what happened in Iraq. There was one major mistake almost everyone I spoke with made, and that I also made in this article, which is that the other major problem people foresaw in the immediate aftermath of the conquest of Baghdad that did not in fact happen. One problem was looting. The other problem that everybody expected was huge refugee flows. The reason that didn't happen is that what was supposed to trigger these refugee flows was the use of weapons of mass destruction. A chemical attack, a nuclear incident, of something like this would make people migrate. That didn't happen for reasons we know, and so that shoe did not drop, but the rest of the shoes did drop. So this was in the spring and summer of 2002. I was trying to put together this prediction of what might happen and what things we should be prepared for if this were going to occur, if there were going to be an invasion of Iraq. About a year after that, when it became clear that information that had not been difficult for me, a civilian, to find from unclassified sources, that somehow this had not been built into the U.S. war plan, with the greatest military power in the world's history, dealing with a country whose military budget was about 1/60th of the United States budget, I went back to do an exercise of reconstructive journalism. This was finally published as Blind into Baghdad. And the idea was to take the year before the invasion and go through week by week and month by month and say, who knew what when? Who was prepared for what sort of thing? And the big surprise to me, something that I think has now become conventional wisdom but wasn't at the time I wrote this article, was it's not that the U.S. was caught by surprise by all of the problems that it encountered in Iraq, because the U.S. government had in fact prepared excellent reports on what it needed to be ready for, things, as you would expect, 1,000,000 times more detailed, more authoritative than what outside journalists have been able to do. And the problem was the disjuncture, the separation of the gears between the existence of all this knowledge at various parts of the government and the decisions about what was going to happen in terms, again, of looting, of troop level, of disbanding the Iraqi armed forces and all the rest. I'll come later on to the difficult questions that we still have to answer about this whole episode in our history. Certainly one of the central ones involves this failure to connect. How could the government have been so well informed about the challenges it needed to address and to have done so little about it? And I'll mention some hypotheses later on. A document that I suggest, there are two documents where you can go look this up yourself if you want. One I'll recommend to you, one I will not, and I'll explain the caution. One is a report by the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, which was issued within the government in December of 2002. That is about 3 months before the hostilities, and it's been made public since then by, the main author was Conrad Crane. And this was an ingenious report. It had three parts. First, it said, let's look at occupations and their structural problems. So that was part one. Part two was, let's look at Iraq and its structural problems. And part three was, let's put those together and come up with a spreadsheet, essentially. And so they had this very detailed, specific action plan, how many troops you would place where, what your problems would be, what things you'd have to work out for. So that is worth looking up at the site of the U.S. Army War College as knowledge our government and our military had created and yet somehow didn't get connected. What I will not suggest to you is something that's recently been made public under the Freedom of Information Act, and this is the so-called Future of Iraq study that was commissioned within the State Department. This was extremely controversial. The man who directed this study, a man named Thomas Warwick, was personally kicked off the occupation team by Dick Cheney. That is, Dick Cheney told Donald Rumsfeld to tell Jay Garner this man, Thomas Warwick, could not be on the transition team. I don't recommend this to you because it's about, many thousands pages long. I got a copy of it early on, and my heart leapt when I came upon the sections in Arabic, because I could just plow through those and make my way. About half of it was in Arabic and the rest was in English. So take it from me that this was sort of less rigorous in its logic than was the case of the U.S. Army War College. So in the second article, Blind into Baghdad, I tried to say, how did it happen? I tried to establish the fact there was all this knowledge and then to raise questions about why it wasn't connected. In the third article in this sequence, which came out in 2004, this was the one in which I tried hardest to sort of raise larger strategic and theoretical questions about America's current, the way America had sort of wended its course in the post-9/11 era, and I'm actually going to read a brief passage. This is not something I often do, but this is an article that I felt very deeply about in terms of the argument I was trying to make. So let me read you something briefly from the beginning and then the end of this article. It begins this way. Again, this came out in the middle of 2004. I remember distinctly the way 2002 began in Washington. New Year's Day was below freezing and blustery. The next day was worse. That day, January 2nd, I trudged several hundred yards across the vast parking lots of the Pentagon. I was being pulled apart by the wind and was ready to feel sorry for myself until I was shamed by the sight of miserable frozen Army sentries at the numerous outdoor security posts that had been maintained nonstop since the September 11th attacks. I was going for an interview with Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. At the time, Wolfowitz's name and face were not yet familiar worldwide. He was known in Washington for offering big-picture explanations of the administration's foreign policy goals, a task for which the president was unsuited, the vice president was unavailable, and many other senior administration officials were, for various reasons, inappropriate. The National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, was still playing a background role. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, was mainly dealing with immediate operational questions in his daily briefings about the war in Afghanistan. And the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, was already known to be on the losing side of most internal policy struggles. I skip ahead. In most ways, the assumptions and tone of the conversation with Wolfowitz now seem impossibly remote. At the beginning of 2002, the United States still operated in a climate of worldwide sympathy and support. A broad range of allies underwrote its anti-Taliban efforts in Afghanistan, and virtually no international Muslim leaders had denounced them. President Bush was still being celebrated for his eloquent speech expressing American resolve before a joint session of Congress on September 20th, 2001. His deftness in managing domestic and international symbols, yes, I wrote those words and you'll hear why, was typified by his hosting an end of Ramadan ceremony at the White House in mid-December 2001, even as battle raged in the Tora Bora region of Afghanistan on the Pakistani border. At the start of 2002, fewer than 100,000 U.S. soldiers were deployed overseas as part of the War on Terror, and 12 Americans had died in combat. The United States had not yet captured Osama bin Laden, but it had routed the Taliban leadership that sheltered him, and it seemed to have put al-Qaeda on the run. Now I skip ahead. Oh, there's one other scene setter for beginning of 2002. Because of the quick and for Americans nearly bloodless victory over the Taliban, the administration's national security team had come to epitomize competence. During our talk, Wolfowitz referred to, quote, one reason this group of people work very well together, unquote, by which he meant that Cheney, Rumsfeld, Powell, and many others, including himself, had collaborated for years, from the Reagan administration through the 1991 Gulf War and afterward. From this experience, they had developed a shared understanding of the nuances of, quote, how to use force effectively, unquote, which they were now applying. In retrospect, the remarkable thing about Wolfowitz's comment was the assumption, which I then had no reason to challenge, that Bush's foreign policy team was like a great business or sporting dynasty, which should be examined for secrets of its success. I'll skip ahead. I also remember the way 2002 ended. By late December, some 200,000 members of the U.S. Armed Forces were en route to staging areas surrounding Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of people had turned out in the streets of London, Rome, Madrid, and other cities to protest the impending war. That it was impending was obvious, despite ongoing negotiations in the United nations. Declaring that it was impossible to make predictions about a war that might not occur, the administration refused to discuss plans for the war's aftermath or its potential cost. In December, the president fired Lawrence Lindsay, his chief economic advisor, after Lindsay offered to guess the total cost of the war might be between $100 billion and $200 billion. As it happened, Lindsay's controversial estimate proved to be extremely low. I'll move on to the end. September 11, 2001 has so often been described as a, quote, hinge event, unquote, that it's tempting to think that no other events could rival its significance. Indeed, as a single shocking moment that changed Americans' previous assumptions, the only modern comparisons are Pearl Harbor and the assassinations of John F. Kennedy. But as a 9/11 enters history, it seems likely that the aftermath, especially the decisions made during 2002, will prove to be as significant as the attack itself. And what I try to do in this article is chronicle, again, week by week in 2002, how the need to respond to 9/11 became the need to attack Iraq, and all the consequences, some of them pro, many of them con, of that effort. I'll mention two other articles just as matters of process, then I'll talk a little more about specifics. I had another article about a year ago called Why Iraq Has No Army. The premise of this article, we recognized that the headline, the cover story, Why Iraq Has No Army, which accompanied a picture that looked as if it were taken from the Ottoman Empire of a somewhat pathetic-looking Iraqi soldier holding a gun with a bayonet, but who was taken just weeks before our issue went to press. We recognized this could be accused of overstatement to say that it has no army. But in terms of the premise of the story was for the United States to make a significant change in its commitment to Iraq, Iraq had to have much more robust security forces than it did, and this effort seemed to not be going anywhere. The query why, and I examined a number of the explanations for that. And in the final part of this installment, I had one other article called Is Iran Next? There was a process secret for this too, which I'll fill you in on. This was an article in the December 2004 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. December 2004 was a terribly vexing issue for us because it would go to press before we knew who won the presidential election between Bush and Kerry, and would come out 2 or 3 days after the election. So we had to have something that would be an evergreen product, no matter whether it was another 4 years of Bush or four years of Kerry. So we thought, what will be a terrible problem for either of these administrations? The answer was Iran. And I'll say more later on, we tried to examine in a novel way the premise of dealing with Iran's nuclear ambitions. And I found one last article in this general corpus, which is not included in the book, but was in last month's Atlantic Monthly, whose headline was, "We Win." And its argument, as I'll tell you more about, is that it was time to declare victory in the global war on terror. But that lies ahead. So to wrap up this long portion of what I'm going to be saying, you have what's collected here. The reason I thought it was worth putting these together and updating them with new material, the beginning and end, and interlinearly, is that a certain kind of journalism, for which I mainly credit Cullen Murphy, is on display here, of ways you can find the stories that the normal media machine will not have time to get to, the ones that are too far in the distance or you're trying to reconstruct the past. So that was the concept behind what we did in the Atlantic Monthly and here in the book. Let me now I'm shifting now to talking about a couple of specific news areas now which are involved in what I've been writing about and involved in the ongoing choices for the country. And then I'll finally talk about the larger questions. These are Iraq, Iran, and the global war on terror. For Iraq, I did a very long email interview. Actually, I did 2 long email interviews with 2 Santa Barbara newspapers over the last 2 weeks while I've been in China. Many of the questions involve the prospects in Iraq. And to my mind, the conceptually most important point for Americans to grasp is that from this stage on, simply there are no good alternatives. That sounds like a political boilerplate, but let me make clear what I mean. Any answer I'm going to propose, or any of you is going to propose too, is going to be bad. And so the question is, which of the bad alternatives is least bad, least unacceptable, and unacceptable in sort of the least impossible ways for us? This is important because politically there is the dynamic of, if you say, well, this course isn't working, somehow you have to say, the idea is, well, what's your idea? And what's your plan? And then your plan has obvious flaws too, because all plans for the U.S. at this point are flawed. They all are bad. Everyone is familiar with Colin Powell's analogy, the Pottery Barn homily. You break it, you've bought it. I came across recently a more accurate one, I think, which is the situation of plans for Iraq is like somebody has taken a hammer and broken up a bunch of crockery and then says, okay, what's your plan? That there is no good plan for dealing with the crockery. To be somewhat more nuanced about that, theoretically, the partition of Iraq, I think, would not be a good idea for a variety of reasons. The oil is not evenly distributed. It's regionally destabilizing to the Turks to have an independent Kurdistan, with Iran to have an independent southeastern Iraq. There has been some idea of an Iraqi nation state over the last couple of decades, which people did seem to prize beforehand. The people aren't evenly distributed, and so you'd have to have some more forced movement of the kind that's going on. So while it might not theoretically, so it is not theoretically a desirable proposition, but it seems to me that's where things are going. And just because the cost of maintaining some central power in Iraq may exceed either the Iraqi government's or the United States government's ability to pay in the long run. So partition would be bad, but it may be the future because there's not a better alternative to that. The surprisingly complex problem for the United States, in my view, is summed up in the following dilemma. We can't stay and we can't go. So we can't stay for obvious reasons. There is political friction in the United States. There is friction the American troops create by being there. There's tremendous strain on the Army. We can't go because, terrible as the violence is now, at least in the short term, it would likely to become worse if the U.S. forces were not there. So, of the bad choices available to the U.S., the question is, which one is the least bad solution to that dilemma of not being able to stay and not being able to go? A background reality that colors all of our discussions of this is that President Bush has pretty much established to everybody that he's not going to be forced out of Iraq, or at least no policy on his watch can be interpreted as his being pushed out. In reality, the U.S. might withdraw somewhat, but that's an unacceptable element in the menu for him. And whoever comes after President Bush is likely to run on an out-of-Iraq policy. So it's how we use those time zones, too, of a very strong in-Iraq commitment and the likelihood of an anti-Iraq commitment 2+ years after that. Here is my brief proposal, which is bad. The plan I'm about to give you is bad, but again, you tell me a less bad one. The bad plan I have to offer you is the U.S. should organize all its efforts to get ready to leave as soon as decently possible, but it should not say so. That is, it should be deliberately deceptive both to its own people and in international negotiations. It should bend all its efforts to having enough sort of propped up security and political forces so that they can plausibly take command and the U.S. can get out. But it should not say so, because that does, in fact, start the clock running, and people do wait you out in that case. So I have more to say about it, but I won't say that anymore just now. But you give me a less bad plan than that, and I will accept your plan. To move quickly to Iran, the question with Iran, well, there's a sequence of questions about Iran, and I'll also come up to a sort of a bad plan, but I'll ask you to beat it at the end of that time. First question, does Iran want a nuclear weapon? The answer is, of course they want a nuclear weapon. If anybody here were in the governing council of Iran, you would want a nuclear weapon. You want a nuclear weapon because Iran thinks of itself as a great power, as Persia, and great powers have nuclear weapons. Also, the lesson of the last 5 years is you get a nuclear weapon and the U.S. cannot invade you. That's a difference between North Korea and Iraq. That North Korea, we can't invade them because they have nuclear weapons. And so, of course, the Iranians want a nuclear weapon. So, next question, would that be bad for the rest of the world? Answer, yes. Every new nuclear power makes it more likely that there will be further nuclear powers, bad in Saudi Arabia, bad in Egypt, bad in Turkey. So it would be bad in general and bad for the United States. Next question, is there anything we can do about it? Sub-question A, can we prevent it militarily? I try to argue at very great length here that we can't prevent it militarily. It is too late to do that, even if it were theoretically desirable. In brief, the Atlantic ran a war game with a bunch of generals and intelligence people saying, let's pretend we're going to take out Iran's nuclear facilities in a surprise strike. The conclusion was, you can't do it. Number one, they're too dispersed. We don't know where they are. Number two, Iran has too many retaliatory tools at its disposal, mainly in Iraq. We think things are bad in Iraq now. Wait till Iran gets serious. And so can we get rid of them militarily? No. Next question, is there some other way? And this is the main diplomatic effort now underway, led by a number of European countries, to forge a grand bargain, a combination of penalties or threats and incentives that will make it worth Iran's while not to do what it would otherwise leap to do of building a nuclear weapon. And that is essentially where our hopes rest right now, of cajoling the Chinese to join us, of following the lead of the Europeans. If that fails, what does that mean? It means, number one, a bad result of another nuclear power, but number two, another power we would have to control through deterrence, as we do China, Pakistan, and all the rest. So that's my very brief comment about Iran. They, of course, want a nuclear weapon. We can't bomb them out of having one, and so the hopes are essentially a grand bargain to keep them from doing so. Third, and briefly, the global war on terror. The argument I made in my recent Atlantic article was not that America will never have terrorist attacks anymore. On the contrary, they are likely to occur around the world for the rest of our lifetimes. This is an age of political terror. But it seems worth declaring an end to the grand global war on terror for this two-part logic. Number one, the enemy we set out to attack, that is Al-Qaeda Central in Afghanistan, has been largely put on the run. Most people who I talked to said that it's unlikely they could put together the same kind of grand coordinated scheme they did 5 years ago. And there will be bombings like in Madrid and the London subways, but not something like 9/11 again, or it's much, much harder for them. So the main enemy we went against has been controlled as much as we can. And the rest of the things that we can't control all the other Islamic groups around the world, we're more likely to contain if we don't do it in a wartime basis. That is, if we have a variety of other means, and I'll just give you details about those later on. But that was the point, that we've had a kind of success in the global war on terror, and it would be better to say this open-ended state of war is over, and we can shift to a more sustainable long-term policy. Let me shift now, and then I'll give you questions too. What are, I think, the hardest long-term questions for all of us collectively to derive from this episode? And I do think that the decision-making of the United States and the political and cultural reactions over the last 5 years will be studied in textbooks for a very long time. Unfortunately, they'll be studied not in the way the Cuban Missile Crisis was, of seeing how there was this step away from the brink, but instead the way the escalation in Vietnam was, of how could one step follow another towards a result nobody intended. The first of these difficult questions is a retrospective one. The question is, could it have worked? By it, I mean the invasion of Iraq, to have a democratic example for the rest of the Middle East. As all of you know, and as we can discuss separately, the most powerful motive, or at least in my view, for the invasion of Iraq was the belief that this was a way you could transform the Middle East. You could drain the swamps in which terrorism festered. You could help the Arab Islamic world prosper in the way East Asia had if you could create democratic, small d, democratic capitalism in one country. That was the idea. My reading of the evidence is that clearly has not worked, but could it have worked? If the U.S. Army War College were listened to, and if all the troops were there, and all the other things. My answer to this is you can imagine perfect circumstances in which it might have worked. These would include waiting long enough to have a really broad coalition of allies, a coalition so broad that the real troops on the ground would often be Arabic-speaking and Islamic themselves, not non-Arabic speaking, non-Islamic troops from the United States. And you would find ways to make it sustainable and have complete legitimacy and all the rest. But as soon as you list the conditions in which this might work, you start thinking how unlikely that is. And so just as a sort of Las Vegas proposition, seems to me so prohibitively unlikely that it could have worked as to be almost by definition impossible. But I say my answer is not conclusive on that, but it is one of the questions we'll be looking at for a long time. Could this have worked in different circumstances? A second question, which is reconstructive in a different way, is since this transformation of the Middle East via Iraq was so important to the people who were in charge of this policy, how could they have been so cavalier? If they cared so much about it, how could they have been so sloppy about it all? I mean, if this really were of first-order importance, why didn't they pay attention to the details? I think the answers will take a long time to come out. It probably will take a change of administration. People will be freer to talk. There will be some equivalent for Paul Wolfowitz of the movie The Fog of War, by Robert McNamara, of somebody confronting the difference between their ideals and the realities. But my guess at the moment, it was a combination of these factors. You had the temperament of a president who thought that his role was to make the big black or white, all or nothing choice, and for whom the details were a distraction. A very different kind of person from my one-time employer, Jimmy Carter, who was immersed in the details to a fault. I once came into his office and saw him poring over the thrust-to-weight charts for the B-1 bomber. This is not something that George Bush would do, but he was on the other extreme of not seeking out either challenges to his views or new information. A combination of his personality, the temperament of the vice president, who at that time was much more influential over him than he is now and had a sort of Spenglerian end of the West view of the struggle against Islamic terrorism. The personality of the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, whose job in theory is to challenge the president with the things that he should know, even if he doesn't know them, and make sure that the different parts of the government work together. She was not really up for that challenge. And the view of people like Paul Wolfowitz, the sort of brains behind the effort, who I think had a weird kind of party politics interpretation of the challenge that lay ahead of them. And here's what I mean. If you look at occupations that were a big nightmare for the U.S., like Somalia or the Balkans, they happened on Bill Clinton's watch. And so it was Democratic pussyfooting with power, you could say, was the problem. If you look at things that happened under Ronald Reagan and the first George Bush, that is the fall of the Berlin Wall, Grenada, other things, the liberation of Poland and the Czech Republic and all the rest, they would lead to the idea that with enough firmness of leadership, these things would work. That if the United States were firm, and I think that is what they actually expected. They actually thought it was going to be like Poland. It was going to be like the Czech Republic. And I think that at some point I expect we'll hear reflection from Wolfowitz and the rest. But we'll have a long time answering that question. The third question we have to answer in the long run is how can we work out a balance between the practical and the idealistic in our foreign policy? This obviously is a vast topic. It's the story of American foreign policy. We want to be a special nation. At the same time, we have national interest. Where we go too far in either direction, we're unhappy. Woodrow Wilson, too idealistic. Richard Nixon, too practical-minded. I think we'll see this episode as one, strangely, of being too idealistic, of thinking that we have an ideal to prepare. And I'm going to end on something none of you would expect. I bet there's not a single person who at this moment is expecting what you'll know 10 seconds from now, which is a quote from a speech by Jimmy Carter. This is not a frequent part of American political rhetoric, but I have a stake in this speech. It was one that I wrote myself. It was delivered on the day that my first son, who is present here, was born. So it's exactly as old as he is, and it also touches on this point, on the long-term struggle the United States has to work out. And I think that these words of Carter's actually are worth bearing in mind about episodes like Iraq. He's talking about the place of human rights and idealism in American foreign policy. He says, Americans are as diverse a nation as the world has ever seen. No common mystique of blood or soil unites us. What draws us together, perhaps more than anything else, is a belief in human freedom. We want the world to know that our nation stands for more than financial prosperity, the idealistic side. This does not mean, Carter said, that we can conduct our foreign policy by rigid moral maxims. We live in a world that is imperfect and that will always be imperfect. A world that is complex and confused and that will always be complex and confused. I understand fully the limits of moral suasion. We have no illusion that changes will come easily or soon. But I also believe that it's a mistake to undervalue the power of words and the ideas that words embody. In our own history, that power has ranged from Thomas Paine's common sense to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. That is, Carter was laying out the fact that we know, it was almost a theological sense, a Niebuhrian sense, the world is always going to be plagued with evil. Nonetheless, we trudge towards what we know to be the right ideal. And so I think that we'd be better off in the next stage of our foreign policy if we can embrace something like that compared to what I expect will actually be the next stage in foreign policy, which is shrinking from any further engagements because we don't want them to turn out the way this one has. With that, I will pause. I will take a glass of water, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have, and then, so we'll have a question discussion, then I'll be happy to talk to you individually and sign copies of this book. So thank you all for your attention.
Earlier you spoke of being unable to make a good decision of action.
Yeah.
What do you think are the steps we need to take to finally be able to make a good decision?
I think as a practical matter, there are not good decisions available. And this, do you mean good results in Iraq or good decisions about foreign policy? I'm sorry, I'm not.
Results.
Good results in Iraq. Here's the problem. You have, in the last 5 years ago, the most observations about Iraq said that while there were these sectarian divisions we're now so familiar with the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds, it was not an active thing. It was not so much like the Balkans, where once the lid came off and you had a lot of this instantaneous slaughter. There were divisions, but they were not acute in the same way. You now have had 5 years of these things becoming acute, and people are being killed and killing in return, and so you have a newly inflamed state of hatred and people with blood feuds to settle. You have destruction of the infrastructure there. You have an empowered Iran who's involving there. So I think, with respect, all we can do is find some way to dampen down the level of violence. So I think the realistic goal is damping the level of violence. Every day there's a headline, 65 Iraqis killed in bus blast, 100 killed in market. If we can get those to days when people aren't killed in blast, that's about the goal.
I liked your idea about planning for the U.S. to withdraw, but I don't know how even with reporters being there the way they are, the limitations on them, how that can really be kept a secret. And you have lots of resources and sources over there. I wonder if you have any idea if any of that's going on now, number one. And number two, why not set, if the Iraqis are supposed to stand up and take care of themselves, their police, the military, et cetera, and Maliki's asking that the U.S. move out by the end of the year, what's wrong with giving a date and saying it's time for you guys to take responsibility here, and we're gonna, and if you don't, we're out of here one way or the other.
I think that it may eventually come to that, and everybody knows there is actually a date, and the date is January 20th, 2009. That's the date when there'll be some very different policy, and probably a month or two before that too. And so the question is, before that, is there something that can happen? And I think there are ways that the U.S. could shift its policy and that would have the effect of making it possible for the U.S. to withdraw without saying, okay, we are leaving and here's a timetable for the troop deployment. And that would be to do everything possible to bolster internal security forces in Iraq. One of the points I make in this book is that has never really been taken seriously. It's often been a sort of second choice assignment for people to be on the training Iraqi troops, and there have been, it's always sort of, there's been no commitment to keep American advisors long enough with the units so they actually get to know them. And so if the U.S. actually, if it rearranged its policies so that their real effect was to get Iraqis equipped to hold down these bomb blasts as fast as possible, that would be the way the U.S. could prepare to get out. And maybe reporters would say, hey, we see you're actually putting a lot more emphasis on training. You say, well, yes, we've said that all the way along. You don't have to say the rest of the sentence, and therefore we're leaving. But all the way along, President Bush has said, as they stand up, we'll stand down. So that would be the way to subtly do it. And again, the date question is perplexing because there is this real date out there, and everybody knows it. A date before that, I guess I do agree with the administration that if you say, at the end of this year we're going, that redoubles the determination of people who want to blow up the marketplace for the next 3 months because they think they just have to wait you out that long.
Yeah, I just wanted to congratulate the Atlantic and your fellow pilot, William Langewish, who is, I mean, his reporting about the Green Zone and also the recovery of the World Trade Center site was some of the best writing I have ever read, and congratulations to the Atlantic for that.
I will pass that to them.
During the fall of 2002, I had the opportunity to teach in London for a semester and followed the British politics closely because I was there in London. And then coming back to Santa Barbara in February 2003, I just happened to be a volunteer here at the Santa Barbara Film Festival and had the chance to drive the director Ken Loach back to his hotel in Los Angeles, and we spent 2 hours discussing Tony Blair. And you haven't mentioned the question, because Tony Blair now has announced that he's going to be stepping down. Why or how did he get suckered into this whole thing?
Now that's a very good question, and it's as hard as the other ones that I mentioned. As a premise to that question, I had a little crack about Colin Powell a minute ago, who is obviously a very estimable figure in many ways, but there are two people, in my view, who could have stopped the war. There are Tony Blair and Colin Powell. If either of them in the fall of 2002 had said, this isn't going to work, I think the two of them would have had the authority in different ways to stop, at least for a while, the momentum. You know, Tony Blair, the mystery of him is he was Bill Clinton's best friend and then George Bush's best friend, and that's a set that doesn't overlap in any other any other human being. So how that could have been, and I think it is, my understanding is that it's a combination of two things. One is, it is the job of the British Prime Minister to be the American president's best friend. You know, in sort of the current dynamic of British politics, that is job number one, is to be the best friend of the American president. And so that was a structural necessity. Number two, from everything I understand, Tony Blair actually believes in the vision of transforming the Middle East. And so he was, in a way, the Mr. Outside to Paul Wolfowitz's Mr. Inside of making the argument of transformation of the Middle East. I don't know this from my own experience with him. I've only shaken his hand one time, and I haven't reported extensively, but that rings to me most true, that he wouldn't have taken this risk in England if he didn't actually believe. And in believing, he made the whole thing possible.
When you were talking about Iran, your take on the nuclear situation there was very bleak. And I'm just curious.
Bleak or weak?
Bleak.
Okay.
Bleak. And I'm curious to know in your work, in your research, if there is conversation going on anywhere in the U.S. military or government circles about dusting off some of the anti-nuclear treaties that that were negotiated at one time that were moving forward and now have
the non-proliferation treaties.
Non-proliferation, all that.
Yes, certainly. The main argument that can be made internationally to Iran is the non-proliferation argument, that it's bad, that everybody is better off if the number of nuclear powers doesn't expand. That's obviously unfair to people who didn't make the deadline, didn't get their nuclear weapons soon enough, but there's a kind of logic to it, of failure, tragedy of the commons type logic, that it's better for everybody if you can contain it at a certain level. And so that is the difficulty, as people throughout the developing world will tell you, is the U.S. in various ways is not complying with the spirit of these treaties, or the letter, in testing new weapons and all the rest, which I assume is what you're getting at.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Is there anything? I've read that there are military people who say, what is the point of these weapons? We can't use them.
There certainly is that argument inside the military. As with almost, here you think you've heard bleak, wait for this. As with almost any different approach to strategy, it requires a vehicle or a vessel to advance the argument. And that vehicle or vessel has to be a politician from the other party. And so either a Democratic politician has to make this part of his or her platform, or the next Republican has to make it part of his or her platform. And for reasons that we can talk about separately, the Democrats are afraid to say things like that, because it'll seem like they're being anti-military. And this drives you crazy, but I think it is the observed reality of the moment. So the best hope, I think, is if a next administration can say, as part of its mixture of making itself stronger, really to put some more teeth in these non-proliferation treaties, including doing what the U.S. needs to do to comply with them.
Yes, I wonder if you chose two questions, possibly two questions. I wonder if you chose the title of your book as sort of counterpoint to the novel, I believe it was Eyeless in Gaza by Aldous Huxley. I suspect that question has been asked before. The other question is, a comment. You said Colin Powell. I believe I have a theory that his role in this was, as a long background as a military man, his attitude was, well, he's the commander-in-chief and I will follow him. The third thing is, I read a letter in the Christian Science Monitor several months ago in which someone speculated the following: what would have happened if we, quote-unquote, bombed Iraq with $10 billion worth of food, medicine, and portable generators, radios, TV sets, and then waited a short while and then invaded? We certainly wouldn't have spent an awful lot more money, and the result might have been much more practical.
Yeah. On the love bombing Iraq, I think, yes, some variant of that, of essentially taking it, making it, of using something other than brute force of arms to take it over would have worked better. Colin Powell, I agree 100% with your analysis, that his entire professional career had been imbued with the idea that the political choices are finally made by the commander-in-chief. And it's impressive to anybody who's had exposure even to the recent military how deeply indoctrinated that idea is, which is a good thing. He's gotten over that recently. Yes, he's gotten over it, but it's taken a while. So the slow boil phenomenon. I think he knows that his place in history has really changed from what it would have been 3 or 4 years ago. And I think he's a canny enough person to know that, and I think that may be a factor behind his recent letter. On the ILS in Gaza, I think that I imagine this as a bonus for people who would know of the correlation. So I appreciate your mentioning it.
Well, when you look at all the violence in Iraq, it seems that a lot of the reason that there's sympathy among the ethnic groups for the violence is because of the lack of infrastructure and the basic misery of their lives right now. And at this point, the American military and the British have tried to do some rebuilding, but it's failed miserably, and it usually ends up getting attacked and destroyed. Is there anybody that's looking at the idea of bringing in a much larger NGO force to actually get involved in the rebuilding of the country?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, as all these have been. And there's a man worth noticing, is a man named Sam Gardner, who's a retired Air Force colonel. And before the invasion, in the fall of 2002, he had prepared what he called a net assessment of Iraq. And he meant that as a pun in 2 ways. One is that's what the intelligence agencies call their judgments, net assessments. Also, he did it by the internet. It was all stuff that he'd found as public sources in the internet. And he had this exhaustive catalog of, here are Iraq's power plants and when they were made in Bulgaria. And here are the spare parts you need from Bulgaria, and they're at this Dresden shipping yard. And here's where the water purification plant is. And so, yes, there were, in theory, the problems of electricity, number one, water, number two, and of course public safety enveloping all those, and then employment, number three, are all important. But if we talk about getting NGOs in there, what sane NGO is going to walk into Iraq now? Just like getting a multinational force, what other nation is going to get in there? So it requires some transformation of the whole playing field to make it worthwhile. And it looks like you have a follow-up concept.
Well, it seems to me that if you actually brought in your multinational military to support the work of the NGOs, as opposed to having them running around with guns through everybody's houses, that maybe that would be a way to work.
Oh, I agree, but then you think in practical terms. This means convincing the British or the Germans or the Hondurans or the Brazilians to send their people to Iraq. Why should they do it? You know, that it's, I mean, the British are already there, but it's unless you can sort of change the overall bargain, you're asking somebody to step into a situation that has brought down Tony Blair and is sinking George Bush. Why should they do it?
Mr. Fallows, you are unique among the brilliant people that the Capps Center brings here. I'd like to challenge you to use your unique ability of looking way ahead of events, something you admit is required for journalists such as you. One way or the other, we will exit Iraq. I'm going back to the first question. I'm much more concerned about our future 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now, because our military-industrial congressional complex, going back to question number one, is so far ahead of us, as I would point out that Chalmers Johnson has challenged those who are willing to read The Sorrows of Empire that ask, why do we need 750 military bases in the world today? So post where we are today, down the way, will leadership emerge to give us the possibility of changing directions?
These are challenging questions, not made less challenging by your buttering me up the way you did in the premise. So let me try to separate them a little bit. If I had to bet on the way the U.S. will get out of Iraq, the U.S. will sort of stay its current course until basically January of 2009, and with probably fewer U.S. casualties, because people will be back in their bases, and increasing casualties for Iraqi civilians, and the U.S. will essentially be driven out at that point in 2009, and the face-saving cover for the United States will be it's a new administration. And they can say, well, we're sort of blaming this all on George Bush. I think that's what will happen. I think that the worst political effect will be, as opposed to some kind of analysis of what happened, it will be like the worst effect after the Vietnam War, when the U.S. could not intervene to stop the slaughter in Cambodia, because we'd just been in Vietnam for the previous 15 years. We couldn't countenance intervening to stop a real genocide in Cambodia. So I think some kind of pendulum swing. The larger perspective of U.S. military bases and military budgeting, I think there are it's a really wonderful and complex theme. The military budgeting, people have tried and need to keep trying. They've broken their lances on this again and again and again, mainly because I think the power on the side of the status quo is so immense and well-financed. It requires a genuine leader to say we can do this in a different way. The last person in that situation was actually Gary Hart. Gary Hart had a very nuanced and sophisticated different defense plan. John McCain could do this if he chose. If John McCain became president and said, this is all a big waste, he would have the authority to do something, but it'd be a long, long battle. I fear that the 750 bases worldwide will also be resolved not in the thoughtful way you're hoping for, but just if the U.S. Has a deteriorating economic position internationally, we'll find ways to pare that back or else to hold on to it, because paradoxically it's what we still have, while losing the money. So I'm not trying to be bleak. I'm an optimistic person by nature, but I think these are going to be very, very difficult problems of policy, and we have to hope for people in leadership who can explain them, can move us in the right direction.
I want to thank you for this extraordinary event. Would you please... Oh, I'm sorry. I can't see you down there. You should stand up. Okay, this will be our final question.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fallows, I'd like to thank you for coming. The first article of yours I read was Bush's Lost Year, and it was the first exposure to the Atlantic Monthly I had. And I want to thank you for both of those things, because I read it every month now, and it's a great magazine, and I look forward to your articles. I'm glad to see such a nice turnout. I'm disappointed not to see more people from my generation here, because this is our war. We're going to be the ones paying for it and are currently paying for it. So that said, this man touched on my question a little bit before, but so I have two questions. Is it going to take 50 years for me to get my fog of war? And also, just a quick something on something you said before. You mentioned that we should have waited longer for to build up a larger coalition and to maybe include other Islamic states or Arabic-speaking states. But what states would have had an interest in supporting democracy in the region, knowing that they might be the next state to fall? And thank you again.
Yeah, no, those are all very good questions. Yeah, those are good questions. On the generational point, I think it's you've touched on a really crucial matter. The most clever and most crass decision American politicians have made in the last 50 years, and that's saying something, as you know, was Richard Nixon's decision to get rid of the draft in the late Vietnam War, because he knew that would essentially, the draft was a really imperfect buffer during the Vietnam War because it was so skewed in the way it worked, and essentially people in any position of privilege were excluded. But that's way different from no draft, and if there were a draft now, all of your classmates would be out there, engaged in foreign policy, and the war would never have happened if there were a draft. So that's something we live with as well. 50 years till fog of war. About this edition, I don't know. I think that when the administration changes, suddenly there will be a lot more. There will be a lot more people in second and third tier positions who will be free to speak. Yeah, and it's starting already now. It's starting with Colin Powell's letter, but the sense when the command of the executive branch is in different hands from what it is now, I think you'll start to see more assessment. That's a very astute question about the larger coalition, and that, of course, was the dilemma of the first Gulf War, that to get a very huge coalition, the promise had to be just kick Iraq out of Kuwait and don't go any further. So the question would be, what exactly was the U.S. ambition in dealing with Iraq? Its stated goal, its stated casus belli, as you remember, the United Nations, was weapons of mass destruction. That was what the United States made its case on. George Bush's State of the Union speech before the war had 18 paragraphs about Iraq. 17 of them were about weapons of mass destruction. The word democracy did not appear in the discussion of Iraq. So I think the U.S. would have been forced to a kind of two-tier policy. If it had to invade for weapons of mass destruction, you could presumably get some Arab countries to deal with that, because they could be objects of it. And then if it wanted to have a democracy agenda in the long run, it could work on that, but not in the immediate sort of invasion force. It would be you try to have an improved version of the first Gulf War coalition, enough to get rid of an imminent threat, and then you would use the United States, would use your moral suasion with other allied countries to try to be democratizing in the long run. A garbled answer, but the best I can do.